All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our last week of lecture for this week. And I'm not going to hopefully spend a whole lot of time talking about this. A relatively short video. I was able to keep it under the 40-minute mark, although I'm approaching 40 minutes right now as I blather on. But ultimately, our last week of class. And please enjoy the video. If any of you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out. I'm always available through email. Otherwise, have a great day. All right. All right. So this week we're going to be discussing standardized testing and high stakes testing. And we've discussed this a little bit over the last few weeks, but there are some issues with um, sort of this accountability movement um, and just sort of the high stakes testing, the standardized testing that I wanted to bring up, and I thought that'd be important for us to discuss today. So that's really what we're going to be discussing today, is just sort of the concerns that have come about because of standardized testing and high stakes testing. And sort of in the interest of full disclosure, this is a topic that I'm very interested in and honestly very passionate about. It's not my area of research, but this was actually an area of research that I wanted to do whenever I first got into grad school. So I walked in when I first got to University of California, Riverside. My goal was to, my stated objective with my research was to essentially take down the structures of high stakes testing and to sort of lead the charge to getting rid of these tests. And rightfully so. My advisor told me to probably think of, take some time to think about this particular topic. And then that led to some other concerns, and I ended up leaving this, abandoning this research topic. But ultimately, just let that, sort of, I want you to be aware of that because that can sort of lend to my discussion points here, and also can show you if I do at some point begin to, I guess, ramble or start to talk very quickly. This is a topic that I'm very interested in. I think that it's a topic that really, honestly, everybody should be interested in, whether or not you are whether you are an educator or you are not. If you have children in schools, this is a topic that should be of interest to you, because especially if you have a child that is, or if you are having children, or whatever your child status may be, you probably have had a child that has taken a standardized test, a high stakes test. Maybe they didn't even realize that they took a high stakes test, and to achieve graduation in Kansas or in a different state, or there is a good chance that you, at some point, if you are going to have children in the near future, my children will probably be taking high stakes testing whenever they get to, Pittsburgh High School. But with that said, it is important to also understand that there is this movement in this country um, to reduce the value that we place on these tests, right? So whenever I was growing up, I grew up in Texas, where, for those that are not aware, that is really where a lot of the accountability movement originated, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. But essentially, in order for me to graduate, I had to, so in high school at Liberty Hill High School in Liberty Hill, Texas, um, you had to take the TAKS, I believe it was the TAKS, TAKS, and you had to take it your freshman, sophomore, and junior year. You were required to take it. Um, and the test included science, math, history. I think it was called social studies though. So history, English, and reading and writing really. And you had to pass all 5 of those at some point in those 3 administrations in order to graduate from high school. And so it's interesting because that was in, I'm not going to disclose how long ago it was when I graduated from high school, but so many years ago. And now you look at Texas, and there is a lower level expectations when it comes um, to requiring testing, right? So they have now decreased the number of tests that you have to pass from X to like half that. And then if you look at California, where they have completely removed the end of course exam in order to graduate, that requirement has been completely removed from the students. And in Colorado, where whenever I worked in Denver, we didn't have that requirement whatsoever. And so there are states where you do see sort of movement toward devaluing or getting away from sort of these high stakes testing decisions. But ultimately, that it is still a large area. It is still a large requirement in this country, and most states do still require some level of standardized testing to take place. And then I guess the question ultimately is, what stakes are attached to that test? Do they require you to pass it to graduate? Do they require you to pass it to get some kind of funding for your school, whatever that might be? And and really where a lot of these concerns came from, and the reason that we are where we are today, is because a lot of the reports, I'm sure everybody has seen these reports of of sort of these rankings of these different countries, and you'll see of all these hundreds of countries, the United States will be 30th in the area of math and 25th in the area of reading. And I'm making up those statistics, but it's just sort of going to the point of ultimately there are these reports that come out that show America is sort of middle of the pack when it comes to our academic skills, and that concerns people, right? For a lot of reasons, right? You can obviously get into sort of the discussion of American exceptionalism and sort of how that raises people's concerns when it comes to our ability to be number one, but also just in the fact that we want our students to be competitive on a global market, and we want our students to be able to compete with any country out there. And if other schools are educating their students better than we are educating ours, then we have to figure that out. We have to improve the quality of our education. And as I mentioned earlier, you saw a lot of the momentum that really started this accountability and this high stakes testing movement originated in my home state, the state of Texas, with in the late 90s, early 2000s, where you had a then presidential nominee George W. Bush, and eventually President George W. Bush, who really one of his campaign platforms was the Texas Miracle. And for those of you that are not familiar with the Texas Miracle, how could you not be? It's Texas. Everything that comes out of Texas is a miracle. Anyways, I'm not a huge fan of Texas, but and so anyways, so if you just were to Google Texas Miracle George W. Bush, you would see a lot of articles that were detailing really how he used the state testing data that was coming out of Texas in the mid to late 90s as this proof that Texas was able to educate students that were not believed to be educatable, if that's a word. And so your students that your non-native English speakers, your special needs students, your students that were sort of traditionally believed to not do, they weren't going to do very well on these tests, and it wasn't, it was just sort of assumed that if you're in a school district that has, high levels of non-native English speakers, or if you have a district that is has a lot of special needs students, then it's going to be harder to educate those students, right? It's going to require more funding. It's going to require a lot more intensive support of these students. But George W. Bush in the late 90s came out and he one of the many things that he campaigned on was this Texas Miracle, and how look at these test scores and how amazing our test scores are in Texas. And if you essentially elect me, then we can sort of we can make it the American miracle, right? We can essentially put the requirements and the standards that we have in place in Texas, we can put those in place for the entire country. And the same way that it has done wonders for the state of Texas, it'll work wonders for the United States. And so really that was the momentum from sort of the Texas Miracle campaign promise was what led to the passing of No Child Left Behind in 2001. And at this point, I don't know that you can find an educator out there that really fully supports the No Child Left Behind Act. I think ultimately we all sort of like the idea of the premise behind No Child Left Behind, but the actual execution of No Child Left Behind was a complete and total failure. But ultimately, one of the requirements of NCLB was that states are now required to establish benchmarks and standards, and they were now expected to administer some kind of statewide test that would assess for these different standards and these and assess the improvement of these schools based on the benchmarks that the school set. And so, really it didn't take long before issues arose, right? So this was passed in 2001, and almost immediately there were concerns of was this fair? Was it fair to pass this rule that tied funding to state test scores? And the issue is that accountability, they have tied this word accountability to it, and we all like accountability, right? If accountability is sort of associated with and mentally of all these positive things. We want schools to be accountable. If we're giving USD 250 millions of dollars of funding, we want them to be accountable for that, right? It's taxpayer dollars. You need to be accountable for the quality of the education that you're giving. So accountability is great, but ultimately, immediate issues came out of schools in California were saying, well, yeah, our scores look different than Texas. We have different standards than they do. Our scores look different from we're in Compton Unified School District, where our poverty rate is so high, and sure, our scores look different from Los Gatos, California, where everybody there is the child of a surgeon or of a lawyer, or sure, our scores look different, but we have higher levels of poverty, we have higher levels of diversity, we have all these different things that are impacting the improvement, right? And so it didn't take long before schools, before districts, before entire states came out and sort of raised the red flag of saying there's an issue here. We don't really agree with this, right? So you have attached funding to these tests that aren't appropriately assessing what you wanted to assess. You're trying to assess learning, and really your test is, this idea is not necessarily assessing learning. Going back to this is a big question I've raised the last few weeks of what are you trying to test? And so really a lot of these concerns were sort of combined into this effort that you saw in the mid 2000s, where educators and state representatives began to call for a sort of a national set of standards, and that is where you start seeing Common Core. And before anybody makes any assumptions about Common Core and sort of the political ideology behind Common Core, I think it's important for everybody to understand that really the idea behind Common Core was began in the mid 2000s, and really when, if you look at the development process, I have the link here of Common Core, and when the development sort of went large scale and began sort of on a national level, that was in 2007. And so I just think it's important for everybody to be aware of that, because there is a lot of political rhetoric around Common Core, and I have family members that hate Common Core simply because they associate it with a certain president. And I think that that is a huge issue, because there are obviously issues with Common Core. Any set of standards that exist are going to have issues. I think that the goal of Common Core was fantastic, in that it attempted to it attempted to level the playing field of schools across the country. But you do see a lot of people out there that have some level of anger toward Common Core simply because of the fact that it is associated with President Barack Obama. And so I just want to make that very, very clear, that Common Core, the goal of it is, in and of itself is good, right? We want to establish a level playing field. And then, obviously there were some concerns with the rollout of Common Core, and with, there was so much blowback about like the math, the instructional strategies of Common Core math. And so, I'm not going to get into that. That's not the purpose of why we're here today. You can go online and find plenty of that discussion online. Usually there is some level of rhetoric surrounding it, but that's not my purpose of being here today. But really, still one of the concerns that was still out there, even after we established this Common Core level playing field set of standards, was, sure, you've given us, now, well, Texas never implemented Common Core, but Kansas, California can say, well, sure, Kansas has the same standards as we do, but we still have a higher level of diversity in the state than Kansas does. We have a higher level. If I said lower level, we have a higher level of diversity in the state than Kansas does. We have a higher level of poverty in the state than Kansas does, which, depending on the region that you look at in Kansas versus California, there's some very, very, there are some areas of Kansas with a very high level of poverty. And so, I think that really the concern that still existed even after the passing and the implementation of Common Core was this issue of diversity and poverty, and are we doing a good job of assessing that, of assessing skills and not poverty and not diversity. We want to make sure that our tests, that the data that is being reported to Washington, D.C. and being considered in Washington, D.C. And being attached to our funding is appropriate, and is also being considered in conjunction with our graduation rates, and the murder rate in our neighborhoods, and the poverty, the level of poverty, and the diversity level, and all these different issues that Compton Unified might be facing versus right next to it, there's a very, a more affluent area right next to Compton, Bellflower. And so, or if you look at Kansas, if you're looking at Overland Park versus sort of your more inner city, Kansas City, Kansas regions, those are issues that are going to be raised, and so that's where you start to see the development and the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so the Every Student Succeeds Act, for those of you that are not aware, is the successor of No Child Left Behind. So if you have any discussions about No Child Left Behind, ultimately what you should be discussing is the Every Student Succeeds Act. And there's a lot of similarities between the ESSA, and the NCLB, but there are some pretty big differences. And one of the big differences is the fact that ESSA allows for schools to sort of report socioeconomic factors in conjunction with their test scores, and it allows for it requires the federal government to consider those issues that I've already raised a few times in the past, and so really that's one of the big goals that was sort of achieved with the Every Student Succeeds Act, was this ability to have our data considered in conjunction with, our test scores considered in conjunction with these other issues that we face that are unique to our neighborhood, right? And so the other point of huge backlash, and this is one that I don't necessarily know that you can really pass a law to overcome this concern, but one of the other big issues when it came to high stakes testing and standardized testing is how we have let these requirements impact our sort of ground level in the trenches workers, right? And those are our teachers, and then also the students that those teachers are teaching. And it's a concern because if you look at there are a lot of different case examples out there of state testing data being tied to teacher pay raises. You can go online and find videos of teachers teaching at school board meetings all across the country. Florida is the one that always comes to mind first, of a man who says, my homeroom, I'm a high school teacher at X high school, and my homeroom is just happens to be the AP Physics students. And in order for me to get a pay raise this year, I have to raise the test scores of my AP Physics students. And over the past 3 years, the average score for these students has been like a 99.8% on the test. And based on your formula that you have passed, you can probably hear my kids screaming across the house right now. But anyways, so and at the point, the school board has passed this formula that now requires for my students to get like 104% on this test in order for me to get a pay raise. And obviously, my students aren't going to get a 104%. Nobody can get 104%. And so that was an issue. And then there was the continued issues of diversity and socioeconomic status. Whenever I worked in Denver, a requirement, if you were a in-class teacher, they still required, this was 5 years ago, so it might have changed since their strike that they had last year. But as of 5 years ago when I was working there, they, in order for a classroom teacher to get a pay raise, there were a lot of different areas where you could get a pay raise based on all these different levels. But one of the big levels, one of the big pay raises you could get was if you improved your students' test scores, right? And so, I think that is a concern, and obviously anybody that is in the classrooms will obviously be concerned because we all want to get a pay raise, right? And And so we all want our pay to go up. And if we attach funding, if we attach our pay raise to the improvement of our students, it is only a matter of time before you have people that will try to game the system. It was a few years ago. I think it was a school district in Atlanta. Several teachers actually went to prison because they were caught doctoring the tests, the Scantrons for their students. And so there's all these different issues of the repercussions of attaching these funding pay raises to test scores. And then also requiring the students pass a test in order to graduate. That was an asinine idea to me whenever I was in high school. And honestly, if I'm being perfectly honest, they Liberty Hill High School, and I'm sure it was most of Texas, required that we take this test our freshman, sophomore, and junior year, and you had to pass it once in order to graduate. So if you passed it your freshman year, you were good. You did not need to pass it again, but you still had to take it your sophomore and junior year. And this was always such a ridiculous idea to me. And so I took it my freshman year, and I passed it, and so then my sophomore and my junior year, what am I going to do? So I just didn't take the test at all, and I was required to sit in the room and sit there for the full 8 hours, but I'm about as stubborn as it gets. So I literally sat there for the 8 hours that they had us testing for a week. So it was 8 hours a day for 5 days. And I just sat there and I would doodle on my Scantron. I would bubble in different answers. And yeah, my test scores from my sophomore and my junior year looked atrocious because I didn't actually take the test. Um, and so obviously you're going to have students like me that just, well, again, I will always manage to find a way to game the system, I guess. And then you have students that are sort of on the other end of the spectrum where they will try and try and try and try to pass this test and they just can't figure out how to pass the test. I had friends that had to go back to take this test in February. They were seniors, February of their senior year. They had to go back and take the test, and they would be finding out right around now if they were going to graduate from high school, and then they would, and then they would fail it again, and then they would have to come back in the summer and try and take it again. And so there's just all these different issues that come around with this advent of high stakes testing and accountability. Um, and so ultimately, that was sort of the reason that I came into graduate school, and my goal was to destroy this structure. But ultimately, the question comes back to what's going to be the replacement? What are we going to replace it with? And so that's kind of the issue. And that's where we have to sort of raise our hands and say, okay, I guess high stakes testing is where we are at this current point in time. Hopefully, one of you fine young individuals will go out there and figure out a much better system. And then you will run for president and you will develop this amazing system and implement it appropriately. But at least until now, there's going to be some level of testing requirement in this state, whether I like it or not, ultimately. But when we're looking at the types of testing that exist in the schools, we have our achievement test, which is like the nation's report card. If you're ever curious about um, how different states are doing, this was a big one that I used for my dissertation, the nation's report card, the national assessment, NAEP, NAEP, nation's report card. Just Google that and it'll come up with the nation's report card pretty quickly. Diagnostic tests are largely what I use as a school psychologist, IQ tests, um, tests that are used to that are administered on sort of an individual basis and used to determine strengths and weaknesses of a student. Um, uh, Intelligence tests, which are hopefully never used for accountability. You have your aptitude test, which is your SAT, your GRE, And then you have your school readiness test, which is mostly, you see most of those like in early elementary grades, your preschool, your kindergarten. And the Bracken is an example of that. If any of you are curious about what the Bracken might look like, go become a school psychologist, and I will train you on how to give a Bracken. They're pretty easy, but ultimately, what the Bracken is assessing whether or not a young child knows their colors, they know their numbers, they know their letters, and that kind of stuff, and then it assesses their level of school readiness. So those are really the types of testing. Pretty simple. And then one of the big issues we need to remember is a test norm referenced or is it criterion referenced? And so ultimately the difference is norm referenced is the bell curve, right? So the bell curve, whenever we look at the bell curve, and the issue is, so a test that is based as norm reference test would be the ASVAB. If any of you have any military experience, you probably took the ASVAB. That is a norm reference test, and actually the score that you get, the highest score you can get is a 99%. I think it's a 99%, 98 or 99. But ultimately, the reason that the highest score you can get is a 99 is because the score is presented as the score that you were presented with is a percentile rank. So if you took the ASVAB and you got a score of 74, then you were in the 74th percentile. And so essentially whenever you're looking at the bell curve over here, that means that you were sort of on this higher end of the bell curve, and which is obviously very good. But then if you look at criterion referenced, that is what hopefully most high stakes statewide tests are based on. They are criterion reference tests where it says, okay, at the end of third grade, we expect a typical third grade student to have this particular set of skills. And we are going to design a test that has those particular set of skills assessed. And if you pass the test, then that means that you know these particular skills and you have passed the criterion. You have met the criterion that we require, right? And if you did not pass the test, then that is evidence for the state of Kansas to know that you don't have the skills that are needed to be successful in your later years, right? And then you want to look at the psychometrics of a test, and psychometrics just is the validity and the reliability. And this is, you could take an entire class just based on just learning about the different types of reliability and validity out there. But ultimately, reliability is the score reliable? Is the score sort of stable over time? And one type of reliability would be test-retest reliability, where I have given student A test A, and then I give student A test A again in 6 months, and is that score stable? Or I give, there's alternate form reliability where I have given student A test form A of a particular type of test, and they do so well on this test, and then I give student A test form B of that same test, and then we see what the reliability looks like there. And there's validity, which ultimately is just, is the test appropriate? Is it measuring what we want it to measure? Right? So if you are a science teacher and you give a student a test and it has questions about World War II, it would be assumed that the validity of your test is probably pretty low. And again, there's so many different types of validity that we can't necessarily get into today. But those are some issues to think about as we are developing, as we are using these tests. And so it can be important to look at the reliability and validity of our tests as just indicators of whether or not these tests are appropriate to be administered in our schools. And then percentile ranks, I already mentioned that. Grade equivalence. So this is a topic that I think is you'll mostly see if you are involved in IEP meetings at all. Grade equivalence and age equivalence, because like school psychologists, we use those quite a bit whenever it comes to our testing. And there's a lot of confusion about these. And the reason there's confusion is if you look at what a grade equivalent is, so I give a Woodcock-Johnson IQ test, and it spits out a grade equivalent of 3rd grade. I'm testing a 6th grader, and it spits out a grade equivalent of 3rd grade. And the immediate assumption is that my student has essentially the skills of a 3rd grader, or the aptitude of a 3rd grader. And really, that's not necessarily true. What it's really saying is that the score that student A got, that this particular student got on this test, is the same score that a typical 3rd grader got. And so there's a difference in there. There's a difference there, right? Because one of those statements sort of makes you think that this student is behind 3 years, and the other makes you think, okay, well, this student is testing the same as students that are 3 years younger than him, but who's your norm reference? And so it raises a lot of other questions that we don't necessarily need to get into today. If any of you want to have a long and in-depth discussion on grade equivalent versus age equivalent, email me. This is sort of the stuff that I really enjoyed eating and chewing on for breakfast. But ultimately, that's not why we're here today, and I don't want to spend 30 minutes talking about that by itself. And then issues of diversity. We've already discussed ad nauseum about these different issues, and so I don't think that we necessarily need to harp on it anymore. And that is it for this week, really. And so I think the last point that I want to discuss. So I'm going, as you can see here, I'm going to excuse the discussion for this week. And a lot of that has to do with just the fact that we have already sort of had the discussion about high stakes testing, right? So I don't necessarily see the need for you all to go online and discuss high stakes testing in more in depth. And so I'm just going to go ahead and excuse it for this week. So you'll see on our grading, on our Canvas gradebook, that there will be 0 points, that this week's discussion will be based on 0 points, so you don't need to worry about that. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the test. Probably by the time you watch this video, the test will have been opened. And so go ahead and get that done, and but if you don't want to do it today or you don't want to do it tomorrow, you have until next Thursday to complete the test. And the reason I'm requiring it be done by next Thursday instead of our typical Sundays is because I want to make sure I get the grades turned in early enough. Excuse me. And so with that, I will say a huge thank you to everybody in this room. This virtual room again. I appreciate everybody's time. I appreciate just everybody's willingness to communicate with me. This has been a very, very fun semester for me as far as this class is concerned. I've enjoyed all your writing. I think that you've all done a spectacular job with your writing. I enjoy reading, so that helps. And so I just want to say thank you. Please take some time to complete the evaluations that are being sent out to let me know how I'm doing. And if you want to provide any personal feedback, always happy to take any feedback that is being given. And yeah, so I think that is it, and I don't want to bemoan the point, but ultimately just thank you. I hope everybody has a great week. If there's a great week, great summer, great future, whatever it might be. If there's ever anything that you need any help with, please do not hesitate to reach out at any point in your career. Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you so much, and have a great day.